The man who condemned Jesus to death vanished from history, without a grave, without a trial, without an explanation. Rome, the most powerful empire the world has ever seen, erased him completely. And what happened in the final years of his life is one of the darkest, most disturbing, and most forgotten stories in the entire Bible. You are about to understand why Rome wanted to bury this name. Most people know Pontius Pilate for a single moment. He's standing before a furious crowd, water dripping from his hands, saying, "I find no fault in this man." And then, in the very next second, he hands Jesus over to be crucified. And then, he vanishes from history. The book closes, the scene ends. Most people assume he simply went on living well, governing his province, perhaps never even thinking about the matter again. But that is not what happened. It wasn't even close to that. What happened to the man who held that kind of power? The man who looked directly into the eyes of Jesus and yet chose the crowd? What did Rome think of him afterward? What happened to his career, his family, his life? And the question no one asks out loud, what did Pilate think of himself in the years that followed that day? We are going to go deep into the life of Pontius Pilate, not just the moment for which he is famous, but the years before it, the dirty political games he played, the brutal decisions he made, the tense and violent relationship he had with the people he governed, and the total collapse that came after all of it. Because Pilate's story is not just an ancient history lesson, it is a mirror. Here is what most people get wrong about Pontius Pilate. People imagine him as a weak man, hesitant, that guy who was pushed by the crowd, who tried to do the right thing but couldn't, who felt guilt and washed his hands without wanting to get involved. This image is much more comfortable than the reality, because the reality is much more disturbing. Pilate was not weak. Pilate was a political predator, a calculating, cold man who used violence as a management tool and who survived 10 years in one of the most difficult and explosive regions of the entire Roman Empire, not by luck, but because he knew exactly what he was doing. To understand what happened at the trial of Jesus, you need to understand who the man sitting in that courtroom was. You need to see the full story. Pilate was appointed governor of Judea around the year 26 AD by Emperor Tiberius. He arrived in a region that was already at its limit. The Jewish people had a deep faith, very strong historical roots, and intense resistance to the Roman occupation. It was not an easy region to govern. Several governors before him had left there with their reputations destroyed. Pilate arrived and immediately made it clear that he was not going to apologize for Rome's presence, and the problems began almost on the very first day. The first great crisis for Pilate in Judea happened right at the beginning of his government. He ordered his soldiers to march into Jerusalem carrying the Roman military standards, those poles with the image of Emperor Caesar at the top. To any other people in the empire, this was normal. It was just a military symbol. To the Jewish people, it was an abomination. Their law, the Torah, absolutely prohibited the presence of images and idols, especially inside their sacred city. All previous Roman governors had respected this. When troops entered Jerusalem, the standards stayed outside. It was a tacit agreement that maintained the peace. Pilate ignored it completely. Perhaps out of provocation, perhaps out of arrogance, perhaps just to establish from the start who was in charge. The result was immediate. A delegation of Jewish leaders traveled to Caesarea, where Pilate was, and respectfully asked that the standards be removed from Jerusalem. He refused. They returned the next day. He refused again. This repeated for 5-6 days in a row. In the end, Pilate agreed to meet with them formally. But when they arrived at the meeting place, they were surrounded by armed soldiers on all sides. Pilate stood up and warned, if they did not stop this protest, everyone there would be executed on the spot. And what did the Jewish people do? They fell to the ground, they bared their necks, and they said they would rather die than see God's law violated. Pilate blinked first. He ordered the removal of the standards. But what that scene revealed was important. Pilate was exactly the type of man who would surround unarmed civilians with soldiers just to test the limits. He tested, and he lost that round. But he learned nothing from it. Some years later, Pilate decided that Jerusalem needed a new aqueduct to improve the city's water supply. The project itself had logic. The problem was the way he chose to finance it. He went to the temple and took the sacred money, the so-called korban, resources that the Jews set aside specifically for God's purposes, and used it to pay for the construction. When the news spread, the streets of Jerusalem exploded in protest. Crowds surrounded Pilate, demanding an explanation. His response was to order soldiers to dress as civilians, mingle into the crowd, hiding clubs and weapons under their clothes. And when Pilate gave the signal, they began to beat the people, without warning, without distinction. Men, women, the elderly, whoever was there was beaten. Many were trampled to death in the confusion. Others were murdered by the soldiers themselves. The protest was crushed, without a trial, without a process, without consequences for Pilate. This was the man Jesus faced in that courtroom. So when you read that Pilate was reluctant to condemn Jesus, you need to understand what that word means coming from a man like that. It wasn't moral sensitivity, it wasn't compassion, it was pure political calculation. Because the interrogation of Jesus was different from everything Pilate had experienced. The Jewish religious leaders brought him to him with a list of accusations. They said he disturbed the people, that he forbade the people from paying taxes to Caesar, that he called himself the Christ, the King of the Jews. Pilate called Jesus inside and asked him directly, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And Jesus answered in a way that was neither yes nor no. It was something that got stuck in Pilate's head. Jesus said his kingdom was not of this world, that if it were, his servants would have fought to prevent his arrest. Pilate then asked, "So you are a king?" And Jesus responded that he himself was saying that, and that for this he was born, to bear witness to the truth. And he added, "Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." And then Pilate asked one of the most famous questions in history, "What is truth?" And he left without waiting for the answer. This scene says everything about Pilate. He was a man who asked the right question and had no patience to hear the answer. A man who recognized something different in Jesus. The biblical text even says he became afraid after this interrogation, but who could not or would not follow what he was feeling. Pilate went to the religious leaders and said clearly, "I find no fault in this man." They pressed harder. They said Jesus was agitating the people from Galilee to Jerusalem. Pilate tried a way out. When he discovered Jesus was a Galilean, he sent him to Herod Antipas, who was in Jerusalem during that period and had jurisdiction over Galilee. But Herod grew bored with Jesus because Jesus performed no miracles nor answered his questions, and he sent him back to Pilate. The ball had come back. Pilate tried once more. He proposed a local custom. During the Passover feast, the governor used to release a prisoner chosen by the people. Pilate put it to a vote: Jesus versus Barabbas, a convicted criminal, a man who had participated in a revolt and committed murder. He clearly expected Jesus to be chosen, but the religious leaders had already worked the crowd, and the crowd shouted for Barabbas. And when Pilate asked what he should do with Jesus, they all shouted together, "Crucify him." It was at that moment that Pilate's wife sent an urgent message to him in the courtroom. She had dreamed about Jesus and was disturbed. The message was direct: "Have nothing to do with that just man." Pilate was surrounded by signs. His own conscience said Jesus was innocent. His wife was warning him. The interrogation itself had left him uneasy. 3 times he declared in public that he found no fault in Jesus. 3 times. Everything. If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. That was a political threat disguised as a legal argument, and Pilate understood it perfectly. He was already on unstable ground with Rome. He had already caused too many incidents, too many complaints, too many deaths. A report reaching the ears of Tiberius saying that the governor of Judea had protected a man who proclaimed himself king of the Jews, that would be the end of his career, of his reputation, perhaps of his life. So Pilate did what powerful men do when their power is at stake. He ordered a basin of water to be brought. He washed his hands before all the people, and he said, "I am innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility." And he handed Jesus over to be crucified. In the years following the crucifixion, Pilate continued in office. He continued governing. On the outside, life went on, but something had changed. Incidents continued to happen, and they became increasingly difficult to justify. The final blow came around the year 36 AD, less than a decade after the death of Jesus. A preacher had gathered a large crowd of Samaritans, another people living in the region, promising to reveal sacred vessels that Moses had supposedly buried on Mount Gerizim. Many people went. Many of them were armed. Pilate saw an armed crowd organizing and did what he always did. He ordered the soldiers to attack. Many Samaritans were killed, others were arrested, and Pilate ordered the execution of the leaders among those captured. But this time, the consequences were different. The Samaritans went directly to Pilate's superior, Vitellius, the governor of Syria, who was hierarchically above him, and Vitellius decided it was time to act. He ordered Pilate to immediately leave Judea and go to Rome to answer personally to Emperor Tiberius for the massacre. After 10 years in power, Pilate was removed from office. He departed for Rome without a choice. But here is the twist that most people do not know. When Pilate arrived in Rome, Tiberius was dead. The emperor had passed away in March of the year 37 AD, and some say the death was not natural, that Caligula, his successor, may have accelerated the process. Whatever the case, the man Pilate was summoned to answer to was no longer there. The trial did not happen, and the historical record regarding Pilate stops. It simply stops. A man who governed with absolute power for 10 years, who made one of the most impactful decisions in all of human history, disappears from official documents without any clear explanation. And this silence says a lot. Over the following centuries, early Christian writers tried to tell what might have happened to him, but the versions contradict each other so much that it's impossible to confirm any of them with certainty. Some sources say Caligula exiled him to Gaul, the region that is today France. Others say he was sent to Switzerland, to the mountains, far from everything and everyone. Still others say he was sent to Vienne, a Roman city in the south of France, where he lived in dishonor until the end. And several of these sources converge on a dark detail, that Pilate died by his own hand. Eusebius of Caesarea, one of the first great historians of the Christian Church, writes that Pilate ended up being forced to become his own executioner, that the judgment he tried to avoid in that Judean courtroom haunted him for years, until the end. We cannot confirm this with solid historical documents, but the fact that multiple independent sources from different cultures and periods point to an end marked by despair, that is no coincidence. It's the collective memory of history regarding what happens with certain types of choices. And there's something that goes beyond any historical document. The name of Pontius Pilate is pronounced out loud every week in churches scattered across the entire world for 2,000 years. In the Apostles' Creed, one of the oldest and most repeated declarations of faith in Christianity, the faithful recite, "Suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and buried." Every week. in Portuguese, in English, in Mandarin, in Arabic, in Swahili, in massive cathedrals and small neighborhood churches across the 5 continents. The man who washed his hands to rid himself of Jesus had his name engraved forever in the history of the Christian faith. He wanted no one to associate him with Jesus. He wanted to be neutral. He wanted to come out clean. And he ended up being the only name besides that of Jesus to appear in the creed. That is ironic in a way that goes deep. So, what do we do with all this? Pilate was not a weak man. He was a powerful man who made a cowardly choice, and that difference matters a lot. He had everything he needed to make the right decision. His instinct told him Jesus was innocent. His wife warned him. Jesus himself spoke to him in a way that clearly disturbed him deeply. He even declared 3 times in public that there was no fault in that man. And yet, when the cost became too high, he yielded. He chose to protect his position. He chose not to risk his career. He chose the approval of a crowd over the truth he himself recognized. And he washed his hands as if that could erase the responsibility. It didn't. The final years of Pilate, to the extent that history records them, were marked by the fall, by exile, and, according to various sources, by the total destruction. The man who judged Jesus ended up being judged by history itself. The man who proclaimed himself innocent ended up carrying one of the most remembered names in entire Bible. Not as a hero, not as a martyr, but as the man who knew the truth and chose to look the other way. The Bible doesn't tell this story so that we feel better than Pilate. It tells this story because the pressure Pilate felt in that Judean courtroom did not disappear with the Roman Empire. It appears every week, in different forms, in different situations, with different stakes. The pressure to agree with what is popular instead of what is right, to protect what you built instead of risking it for the truth, to wash your hands of something you know, deep down you know, is wrong. Pilate had his moment, and the question this story leaves for you is simple. When your moment comes, what will you choose? If this video made you think, watch the next one. It will change how you read the Bible.